Okay. Got it. Sashi Burgi Joje Madon Rewriting Jin de Gembadia Sangye Jindu Mide Wagi Dogu Nanda Jinga Jabajo Idon Guru Ranamanda Lagamni Yatayami Sangye Judon Sugi Chonama Janju Badu Dani Gazu Ji Dagi Juje Gebezu Nangi Dola Beju Sangye Dubasho Sangye Jodon Sogi Chonama, Jaju Badu Dani Gazuji, Dagi Juji Gibe Zanangi, Dola Beji Sagi Duba Sho. Sangye Jodon Sogi Chonama, Jaju Badu Dani Gazuji, Dagi Juji Gibe Zanangi, Dola Beji Sagi Duba Sho. Well, anyway, all of you keep it going. So this is not a one-man band. This is like a true group effort, and I appreciate you all. So, any questions from the last class, if you can remember back that far?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
You left us hanging with the phrase, we need to understand subtle impermanence before emptiness. And then you stopped the class. So I was like, well, I hope he goes into that more.
Perfect. It's
Okay.
right on point because it's
Okay.
kind of where we left things off. You're exactly right. We were on verse 21, right? Here, I'll just read it in
I think
English.
we had entered into 22, hadn't we? Or am I mistaken?
Right. We had finished 20 and 21, and we were just entering into 22, which gets into Anila's question.
Okay.
But I'll just read 21 to kind of refresh our memories and then go into 22.
And before you do that, I just want to say that this was the basis of one of the best pieces of advice you ever gave me, Wilson, was like, and I'm paraphrasing, but don't worry so much about emptiness. Just try to understand dependent origination.
Well, actually, that's exactly true. I was reading further to get ready for the class, and Nagarjuna around verse 30 or 31, he really goes into this and why Buddha did not start by teaching emptiness. Um, and so I don't know if we'll get there today, but we've always had that root bodhisattva vow: do not teach emptiness to those who are untrained, right? That's one of our main vows. And I've always trusted there was a good reason for that. But Nagarjuna really gets into it and why it's so important. And actually, well, since we're on this tack, I'll say this before we go into the text. I had a recent discussion with an old friend who was asking, why do Buddhists worry about the current state of events? Because they believe in emptiness. So why get all upset about what's happening in the world, right? And while the friend is very sincere about their interest in Buddhism, that to me reflects not really understanding emptiness in the sense that for a bodhisattva who's high on the levels of realization, and for the Buddha, that's true. Like, for instance, if you hear His Holiness talk about climate change and about how scientists are saying that the world will pretty much go up in flames if we keep on the current course, and life as we know it will become extinct. When His Holiness, I heard him talking about it, and he said, well, you know, um, scientists seem to say that, the chances are that if we keep on the current course, life on Earth will be destroyed by the heat that will be generated. So those of you who don't want to see the Earth destroyed, it would make sense to take care of that now, right? But not at all perturbed by it or disturbed. I mean, if you think about it, Buddhas have watched universes come into existence, stay, be destroyed again and again and again. When His Holiness gives Kala Chakra, for example, after they create the mandala and they bless it and they invite everybody into it, then at the end of the ceremony, they destroy it. And it's an acknowledgement that anything that comes together eventually will part. Anything that's created eventually will be destroyed, right? And that's the nature of compound phenomena. And so this world too will eventually be destroyed. So why be worried? Well, for a Buddha, they don't have to worry because they are no longer bound to the world. And for a high level bodhisattva, they don't have to worry because they've already reached high levels of realization and they can just go into a pure realm and continue their path without much hindrance. But for the likes of me, it's a bit of a problem. If the world system as we know it gets into a war and it's countless lives that are really hurt, right? And so thinking that everything is empty, empty of what? And so that's what really needs to be understood if you're going to really understand karma. And the way to get to understand that correctly is through dependent origination. So one who sees dependent origination clearly sees the intent of the Buddha. Right now, as these karmas around us are ripening into the conflict we see around us, it could go either way. Forces of fear and hate could win, in which case there's not a lot of hope for all of us, right? Or the next generations. Or also the forces of love, compassion, and intelligence could win. And if that wins, there's hope for future generations that this will continue to be an earth on which Dharma is practiced and taught. And so that has big meaning from a relative point of view, right? So anyway, these questions are actually very profound and very on point. So if we get into the text, thus, nothing whatsoever is created and nothing whatsoever will cease. The path of creation and destruction was taught for a useful purpose. And so this gets back to that point that Buddha didn't start by saying everything's empty of self-nature. He started by talking about death, impermanence, death, suffering, and the wheel of existence. And he taught that for a purpose. Because for us who have not yet, or I can't speak for you, I can only speak for myself, but for the likes of me who have not yet reached high levels of the path, I'm kind of trapped in a view of relative truth. And so for me, I can't help it if my life is threatened. I can't help but clench, kind of get afraid. But if you take high-level lamas, like I heard about Trungpa Rinpoche, and there was also another Kagyu Lama who lived in this area for a while, Khensen Kujuk Gyaltsen, a Drikung Kagyu Lama. And both of them were approached at one point by somebody with a gun who threatened to kill them. And both had the same reaction. Go ahead, shoot. Kujuk Gyaltsen's reaction was, I'm not at all afraid of death. If you want to shoot, shoot. And so at that level, when you reach that level of realization, then everything becomes workable. But for us, Buddha taught the initial stages of the path so that we could become disenamored with cyclic existence, and we could get decontagion from always trying to find happiness through sensory pleasure, and so that we could go inside and start to see the deeper levels of reality so that we could actually free ourselves and become like those great lamas who were no longer perturbed by the vicissitudes of life. So what Buddha taught is in verse 22. By knowing creation, you know destruction. By knowing destruction, you know impermanence. Through knowing how to enter impermanence, you eventually come to realize the truth. And that's getting to Anila's question about subtle impermanence. Or what was that Stevie's question? I'm getting confused.
It was Anila's question.
Okay.
I just made comment on it.
Okay. So this is getting straight to that question, Anila, of subtle impermanence. So Buddha started by talking about the truth of suffering. And then he talked about what creates suffering. And part of those teachings on the truth of suffering were about impermanence and death, how we cling to this body and this life, but eventually it will leave us, how we cling to our relationships, but eventually they'll part, right? And so all of those teachings were so that people could start to realize their impermanent nature. And if you look at most crimes, they're driven by fear of impermanence and suffering. People thinking they'll find happiness through robbing or killing or other forms of activity that in fact just create more causes for suffering. So to disenamor that kind of behavior and that kind of wrong way of dealing with relative truth, the Buddha taught about anything that's created eventually will dissolve. And by knowing that things will eventually fall apart, you start to understand impermanence. That I was created, I will be destroyed at some point. By knowing how to enter impermanence, and that's getting into subtle impermanence. So we can see with our sensory perception, we can see gross impermanence, like when a friend dies, we can see that they're no longer animate. And we may not know what happened to their mind, but we can see their body start to decay and deteriorate. And so we can know gross impermanence. But how, if we knew them a long time, how did they go from that youthful, vibrant human being into this elderly, sick person who eventually stopped breathing? Did it happen all at once? Or how did it happen? And so subtle impermanence is not visible to the eye. We can see gross levels of impermanence, but by logic, we can put together that, this change didn't happen all at once. It's been happening continually. And then if we go further into logic, for this moment to come, what happens to the previous moment? Where is it? Once this moment comes, where is the previous moment? It's gone. For this moment to come to be, the previous moment must cease. And we talked about the seed and the sprout. For a seed to produce a sprout, the seed must cease to be a seed. If it continues to be a seed, it can't turn into a sprout. right? And so for the sprout to come into being, that seed must give up the aspect of being a seed. And this gets into the previous verse, seeing that there's no inherent creation and no inherent destruction. For that seed to change into the sprout, it can't have self-nature to it, or it would always be a seed. It always had that essence to it. But because it lacks any such essence by causes and conditions, it can give up the aspect that we would call a seed, and it can become the sprout. The subtle impermanence is that for any moment to come into being, the previous moment must have ceased. The previous moment that produced it must have ceased. We cannot necessarily see that happening, but it's happening in milliseconds all the time for existence to be. And the more you become aware of that subtle impermanence, that subtle level of change, the closer you get to seeing the emptiness of phenomena. That's a pathway into understanding emptiness. And so that's being got at in this verse where it says, through knowing how to enter impermanence, you eventually come to realize the truth. That seed lacks any self-nature. It's changing moment to moment. It's impermanent. For it to produce a sprout, it ceases to be. It never was to begin with, or it couldn't have changed into the sprout. It's merely a conflux of causes and conditions that I impute to be a seed, right? That aspect of being a seed is imputed by my apprehending consciousness. But in its nature, there is no inherent seed there. And so when we start to have that level of cognitive realization, which comes from logic rather than direct perception, then we start to come closer to a correct view of emptiness. If that's true of the seed, then I also can apply that to me, right? The seed of Wilson that was in my mother's womb when I was conceived eventually turned into what looked like a baby. And the baby got labeled Wilson and then fed. And then it got to be this old gray dude with the raspy voice, right? But it couldn't have become where it is now if it ever had any moment of having self-nature to it. It couldn't have transformed that way. And it's been changing moment by moment, subtly, until that youthful infant became this old guy. And eventually, this old guy will show gross impermanence. And then the subtle seeds of the continuum, based on the good, the bad, the indifferent, karmic seeds that have been laid down in this continuum, will give rise to other phenomena, right? Good or bad, based on my karma. So the more you understand that dependent arising, the more you understand the importance of observing karma. It's not that seeing the emptiness of the world makes you think, oh, what the hell? So what happens to it? Instead, it makes you very cautious. It makes you very careful not to create any negative karma and only create virtue. Sarmikan Rinpoche once said that for an arhat or an Arya Bodhisattva who sees emptiness directly, for them, if you put a poison snake in their lap, they wouldn't experience much fear because they've overcome their fear of dying and those kind of temporal fears. But if you suggested they do a bad deed, they would be terrified. There's no way they would do a negative deed. Yes, Anila.
So about the snake in the lap thing, is it because so it is because they're um not scared of death? I thought it was because they just figured that their karma was so good that the snake wouldn't bite them.
Um, I wouldn't say that. Um, and here's why. In the sutra of the that's often quoted when Buddha was a bodhisattva and he was on a boat with 500 salesmen and somebody planned to kill all the people on the boat. Um, he threw a spear, stopping the life of that would-be mass murderer out of compassion for him and the fellow sailors. And that became a good deed because of his motive. However, the way the sutra starts is Buddha's walking with some of his disciples, and he stepped on a thorn and started to bleed. And the disciple said, I thought you were beyond suffering. How could this be? And then Buddha said, well, and then he told the story about what had happened in a previous life. And then he ends with, because of the bad deed of taking life, it ripened in this life by my stepping on this thorn, which punctured my skin and caused physical pain. But because of the motive and what I did out of love for that individual and for all the people that were on the ship, it became a cause for my current enlightenment. So, so it's not that the poison snake definitely won't bite, the Arya or the Arhat in whose lap it crawls, right? But it's that they see the dependent arising. This is some karmic arising. Um, I'm less afraid of death than I am of harming anything or the snake or, and so it's a totally different perspective. There's a story, very famous story of Shariputra. When he was wandering, he came to a house and knocked on the door to beg for food. And when he walked in, there was an old man at the table bouncing a baby in his lap, and his wife was serving him a fish that she had fried, and the dog was trying to get the fish, so he slapped the dog. And when he saw Shariputra, he said something really rude, like, "Oh, you begging yogis are of no use to anybody. You're ridiculous," or something along those lines. And then Shariputra said, you look at me and think I'm ridiculous, but I'm looking at that fish you're about to eat, which is the incarnation of your father who used to fish in the lake out back, and therefore it came back as a fish. And I'm looking at the dog you just slapped. That's the reincarnation of your mother, who was attached to the household and was reborn as a dog that became part of your family. And I'm looking at the baby you're bouncing in your lap. That's your wife's former lover who you killed out of jealousy, who's now your son. So you think I'm ridiculous, and I kind of think you're ridiculous. And that's kind of a high level yogi's perspective. Um, I heard a story one time. Lama Zopa Rinpoche was meditating in retreat in Kathmandu in the valley, and suddenly just everybody around heard these peals of laughter coming from his retreat space. And one of his students asked him, Rinpoche, what was so funny? And he said, when you see the futility of how people act in cyclic, the yogi can either cry or laugh. And so it feels better to laugh, because it's such an appalling show, something along those lines. But anyway, I hope that helps.
Do you
So
think that it's that we just have this forgetting, like this habit of forgetting, that death is could happen at any moment, forgetting that we are, that it isn't that this pleasure is going to last forever kind of stuff. It's kind of this forgetting thing that makes all of this impermanence so hard to grasp, because we live in constant denial that we're, I remember a teaching of we're actually in a river of pus and blood with our mother caged, and bound by iron, sweeping down this river towards the hell realms. That's where we are, and I was thinking, no, we're not. We're in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I'm sitting at the feet of my teacher. That's not the river of pus and blood. And he said, no, it is. And we
that's
forget that in a
that's why
way.
that's why often when I show this image of the wheel of life, I liken it to a marquee in a mall saying you are here,
Uh-huh.
right? That's where we are. And so yes, we forget, we deny, we can't see because of our own, there are different levels of ignorance, right? I mentioned two levels of ignorance: the ignorance of cause and effect, which is a relative ignorance, and then the ignorance that clings to the aggregates as if they constitute a self. Buddha started his teaching by trying to remove that first ignorance, the ignorance of cause and effect and how relative truth works. Later, when disciples became more mature and they were no longer enamored by cyclic existence and they developed bodhicitta, for example, then the Buddha, when they were ready, would teach them dependent origination and emptiness, so they could get rid of that second type of ignorance that drives the whole machine. But he didn't start there, because otherwise people fall into that extreme that I mentioned to begin with. Well, if everything's empty, then nothing matters, right?
I also think that and some people, that what I see is people emphasizing emptiness, and as a result it becomes this event or this achievement as opposed to a natural effect of accumulating merit and doing good and right view and ethics and all of that. But they see, like, if I just meditate long enough, I quote, I meditate long and hard enough, I'm going to see emptiness, which is true, sort of. Does that make sense?
It's hard to know.
Yeah.
Sarah Rinpoche used to have fun telling stories about his time in Sarah as he was training. And one of them, one time he was showing us images of Sarah monks, and there was one monk with kind of a startled look on his face. And Rinpoche made the joke, he just saw emptiness directly, and everybody laughed. And then he told us this story about a fellow monk when they were talking about emptiness, when they were going through Uma class, Madhyamaka class. The monk said, I think I saw emptiness. And all of his friends said, well, what does it look like? And he said, it's kind of yellow. And so he got the nickname Yellow Shunyata. But anyway, there are lots of stories like that, but it's generally thought, even if you can see emptiness directly, that you don't brag about it or you don't talk about it, because you don't want to mislead anybody. So it's considered unethical to say things like that. And so I always suspect when somebody tells me they saw emptiness directly, a part of me always kind of thinks, yeah, I don't know. Not sure. But I do think very often the first mistake is falling into nihilism. When people hear about emptiness too early, they start denying the truths of cause and effect. And that's very dangerous. And again, Nagarjuna is going to go into that in more depth in a few verses. But right now he's introducing the notion that there was a purpose for why Buddha did not start with these teachings. And so that's where we are. I'll show you verse 23.
Wilson, this is Sharon. I have a
Hi,
quick
Sharon.
question. I have a quick question about emptiness,
Mhm.
elusive emptiness. Is it not also, am I wrong? It's like a state you enter into of awareness, so to speak. I mean, not like just by meditating and you're there necessarily. I mean, I'm talking a very elevated state, like Buddha does.
Well, the state itself is considered sacred. The wisdom that is able to perceive emptiness directly and accurately is considered sacred.
Oh, okay.
Emptiness itself is neither sacred nor not sacred. It's just a phenomena that any compound thing, anything whatsoever, lacks any inherent nature.
Parent self nature. I'm talking about, me, Sharon, but I work on, dissolving all the afflictions and all the other things that I have to get to this point. So it's not just a state, not a state, a permanent thing, but it's like an elevated place that you're trying to reach for, correct? I mean, when you say perceive, you're not talking about like our sight, like
No, it's not.
the aggregate of sight.
No, you cannot see emptiness with your sense faculties.
Correct. Okay.
It's an object of cognition of your mental faculty. And generally what happens is you hear teachings on it, you start to get a conceptual idea of what it might be, right? Which is the first step. And then later, as your meditation deepens, you can go from a conceptual, accurate view, an accurate concept of it, to eventually when you reach a state of really one-pointed concentration and calm abiding, then that conceptual view of emptiness can go into a direct mental perception of it. And that's, if you're on the bodhisattva path, that's called the path of seeing. But that's a rather lofty attainment, and it takes a lot of prep, right?
Oh, no, no disputing that. It's just, I wanted to make sure that I really understood, what it is I'm going after. That's all. And so, yeah, go ahead.
That's exactly why it's so good that we're studying this, is that's exactly what we're doing. We're trying to get a correct conceptual construct of it. And then meanwhile, in meditation, we do imitate it. There are analytical meditations that we do, and there are also what are called space-like concentrations. That's where you withdraw on all appearances in your mind and you kind of imagine like a sky free of any kind of obstacle. You imagine that being the emptiness of everything. But still, that's a concept. But it gives you a temporary kind of approximation of the experience of direct perception of emptiness. And so there are lots of meditations like that. They're all useful. And they prepare you for eventually that direct perception of it. But my understanding of the more I study and practice, my understanding of it is it's more of a dispelling. And to really properly understand it, you have to first get hold of a sense of how you grasp at a self. And Serme Rinpoche used to say this, if a military general has all the weapons in the world, but he doesn't know where his enemy is, the weapons are of no use. Similarly, in this kind of meditation, you can have all the logic in the world to support your view of emptiness. But if you have not yet fully identified how your mind is grasping at self-nature, then you don't yet know the target to use that logic with. So a lot of the meditation at first is trying to get a recognition of your internal instinctive habit at grasping at me and mine until that becomes very clear to your mind. And so that's the first, I think the first thing to try to do as you're trying to meditate on emptiness.
Okay, that was a great answer. Thank you.
Sure. One example for that helped me when I first was reading about this was the example of if you're walking next to a friend, you have to keep your eyes on where you're walking, but a part of your mind is also aware of your friend walking beside you. Similarly, as you're going through your daily activities, to have part of your mind aware of what you're doing, but another part watching for that part of the mind that grasps and presents a image of self, so that you start to know that level of the mind and how it grasps at me and mine. Anyway, I hope that helps. Okay, so verse 23. Actually, I'll go to the Tibetan so that we can look at verse 22 in Tibetan. The first word is Gyewa Shepe, which means knowing birth or knowing arising. Jipa She, you'll understand destruction or things falling apart. The next line, Jipa Shepe, by knowing destruction, Mitakshe, you'll understand impermanence. Mitak Nila Jukshepe, that impermanence itself, towards that or into that, entering it, Shepe through that knowledge, Dampe Chukyang, the holy Dharma itself also, Topargyur, you'll understand. You'll understand the holy Dharma itself as you enter into that subtle impermanence and start to dwell there in your thoughts and your awareness. All right, which brings us to verse 23. Actually, a few more comments on verse 22. There are four ends. We're starting to get into that there's no real owner to suffering, the five suffering heaps, and it has no self-nature to it. They're called four ends. Anything that begins with birth ends with death. Anything that meets parts. Anything that is collected disperses. All compounded things are impermanent. So those are called the four ends. And Yume Khyentse Rinpoche, in his comments on this verse, said all the three realms are like a huge fire. It's like a blazing pit of fire. And I think we're in an uncannily privileged time because we can see this through social media and the news. We can see all around the world. It's like a huge heap of suffering anywhere you look. The beings are experiencing terror in so many places, direct, brutal forms of suffering, like in Gaza and other places around the world. And everybody is tormented by that uncertainty. There's no safe place, really, when you start to look at it. That's the nature of samsara and how it's always been. Yeah, Stevie. You're muted though, Stevie. So
Can you repeat the four real quickly?
anything that begins with birth ends with death. Anything that meets parts, anything that is collected disperses, and all compounded things are impermanent. So that's the truth
Thank you.
that Buddha wanted disciples to understand at first, so that they could get serious about the path. Derek, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, Ani.
Oh, sorry. No, I'm using my
Karuna.
my dad's laptop.
Well, I saw the name Derek, and then I said Healy. Oh, that's Ani.
Yeah. So the all compounded phenomena, why is that? Like, see, I don't want to sound all like diamonds are forever, but aren't diamonds forever?
No.
Oh, they aren't. Oh, huh.
Yeah. Uh-uh.
Yeah,
They
because
last a
I
long
never,
time.
no, but like the all compounded phenomena, from a scientific standpoint, is that, can we prove that? It sounds like a very big statement.
Okay. Any scientists here?
I
We have
cannot
these-
prove that diamonds are not forever. I just believe they aren't. How could they be?
Well, diamonds can actually be crushed.
Right?
So there's
then you have
that,
diamond-
it doesn't
have
necessarily
diamond dust, but no
stay in its
diamond.
form. And they're also altered, so they don't come out looking like the diamonds we wear on our fingers or our necks and earrings. So they can be changed and altered or crushed and turned into something else.
So I
That's
looked it
how
up.
I see it.
Perhaps
Yeah.
perhaps it might be best to think how they started. They started not as these diamonds. They started out, I believe, as carbon and pressure, right? The element of earth and minerals and became diamonds. So how could they last forever if they became from something else?
That's the idea. And so while you guys were talking and everything you've said so far, Sharon and Stevie, it's all true. I looked it up on my Google. That's why I say we know now. We have this at our fingertips. But here's one overview about diamonds. They degrade. Over time, diamonds will break down into graphite, which is a lower energy form of carbon. So even if you don't carve them or break them into pieces, they're not permanent. So
Nothing is.
Thank you.
nothing compounded can be permanent.
Wilson, will you repeat again the I mean, what is the term that you use for these four? Can you repeat them again? I just took notes, but I wanted to ensure that I have kind of the language that you got, so I can meditate on this, think about this on my own.
Art translated them as the four ends,
Four ends.
endings, the four ways things end. All that begins at birth ends with death. All that meets parts, all that is collected disperses. All compounded things are impermanent. So that's one of the teachings of the Buddha. And as I said, Art translated it to four ends, E-N-D-S. So Jume Khenpo comments that all of existence, cyclic existence, is like a burning fire. And and that Buddha taught these beginning teachings so that disciples would want to be free of it and to gain escape, which is the first step, renunciation, right? Impermanence spurs you to do something about your imperfect situation. Like we know that we're going to die, so we got to do something, right? A lot of people you'll see who make a lot of money, they'll build a bomb shelter and get provisions and make sure. I heard there was a meeting of some of the world's richest men, and they already have bomb shelters and all sorts of things in case whatever could happen happens. But what they couldn't figure out, apparently, in this meeting was how to get staff to be loyal to them if money became useless. And so, as a friend used to say to me, the person who dies with the most toys dies. And so even the richest people in the world are trying to live forever. They can't. They're compounded like the rest of us. And so in the end, that's where we end up. So I think better to put your investment in Dharma than in the stock market. You have a better chance of a happy outcome. All right, so the next verse. Gang dak den xing dawa jung. So for those who Tendang Dawa Jung is dependent origination. Ten is to depend. Jing means and. Drawar means a connection or relationship. Junghua means coming forth, dependent origination. Ge Dang Jikpa. Ge is birth. Dang Jipa is destruction. Nampang Pa means thoroughly abandoned, birth and destruction. So for those who understand that everything is dependently originated, they can see there's no inherent birth, no inherent destruction. That birth is interdependent on many things. So is destruction. And so they see there's no inherent nature to either one. Shepherd Yerba, that thorough understanding, Dedak, those. Dargyur, Dar are views. Sipe is existence. Gyatso, the ocean of existence of samsara and the views that drive samsara. Gyal, they can cross the ocean of samsaric views. So this gets into those of you, because we're talking about renunciation, so what comes to mind is Tsongkhapa's famous poem, The Three Principal Aspects of the Path, right? Where he starts out with renunciation. When he gets into this section on bodhicitta, he talks about being drawn by four strong river currents. All beings are drawn by four strong river currents. What are those four rivers? And this is from the Abhidharma literature. The first is called views of eternalism, nihilism, self-existence, those wrong views. Ignorance, the two types of ignorance about relative phenomena and the ignorance holding to a real self. Desire, sensual desire. Most everywhere you look, beings want good food, good music, sex, fame, money, right? The sensual desire that drives all beings. And the fourth one is existence, to continue to exist, right? That those are the four river currents. And driven by all those four currents, all beings who have all been our mothers experience birth, sickness, old age, death. That's where it leads again and again and again. So those who understand dependent origination can free themselves of those wrong views, the ignorance that drives them, the craving for sensual pleasure, and the craving for continued existence. So that's the road to become free. Soso Kewo, this is Soso Kewo is a term that's used for any of us who have not yet reached the path of seeing emptiness directly. So you could call it an ordinary being. Soso means manifold or diverse ways that beings manifest, right? Ordinary beings. Ngu Ngundakchan. Ngundak. Ngu means bhava, which means an entity. Dakchen means emaka, which literally this is a belief in a self, right? It literally means one, an ordinary being, who have a belief in a self, who conceives of real entities and real skandhas. So that's like who we are, before we enter the path. We're an individual being who believes in real entities, a self, and real skandhas. Ye means existence. Mepa, non-existence. Chinchilok means backward views. So this gets into the mistaken beliefs that drive samsaric beings. There are 4 of them. Anybody remember the 4 backward views of samsara? Believing that which is impermanent is permanent. Believing that which is impure to be pure. Believing that which has no self has a self. And then
Suffering and pleasure.
all right, believing that which is in fact suffering it to be pleasure. So those are the beings that are being referred to in these first 4 lines. Nyepe, by flaws, nyumong, are mental afflictions. Wangyurnam means under the influence. Wangyur means under the influence of these faults, countless faults that come from those viewpoints and the mental afflictions that arise out of that self-grasping. Rangi Sem, their minds, Gi, by those afflictions, Obagur, become fooled. So all beings are fooled by the afflictions. All of these wrong views. And so when you think of all of us sentient beings, it's a little bit when you look at a lot of the division right now that's happening in our country, right? A lot of it comes from how people have been programmed, which news source they're listening to, whose statements they believe and whose they don't, right? And we get very different pictures of reality based on who we trust and who we go to inform us about reality. But we're all deceived. We're all deceived by these 4 river currents that we mentioned of views, ignorance, desire, craving for existence. We're all fooled by thoughts of existence and non-existence, four backward views that we mentioned, and the afflictions and the different faults that come from these different views. So even though we want happiness desperately, because we're fooled by all of this, we're in fact experiencing suffering and creating the causes of suffering. And that's kind of how it's been from beginningless time until now. So now we have a chance to escape all that. All right, which leads to the next verse. Let me make sure I didn't leave anything out. All right, yeah, you make interpretation. At this point, he got into the nature of the mind itself a little bit. And that the mind that's being forced to wander in samsara, the real tragedy is that itself can be purified and has a pure ultimate nature. Sarme Khenrinpoche used to tell a story from the Namda Lakchan, the text Freedom in Our Hands, about these beggars who every night would come back to their campfire after all day going to town and searching for anything to eat they could find, and they'd bring whatever they salvaged back to their campfire at night and talk about their misery and how they, if only they could be rich and how good it would be. And all the while, when they'd come back to their campfire, because they only came at night, they couldn't see that the rocks they were sitting on were pure gold, right? And this is an analogy to us, that we're wandering through samsara, we found a perfect human birth, but we can't see what we're sitting on. And because of that, we're trapped and we're constantly wandering like beggars, trying to find happiness. Where the real nature of our minds is a gold mine. And so that's the direction that Nagarjuna and the Buddha are taking us, into that inner resource. So the next verse, verse 24, no, verse 25. My vision, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to appear. Ngala kepa namgini. So nga is entities. Ngupo is any phenomena that is produced. It's any produced phenomena that has the capacity to affect things and can be an agent that is causal in nature. Those are called ngumpo, entities. Towards phenomena, let's use the word phenomena or entities. Kepa Namgi, by the wise, in this case, the wise are those who understand dependent origination and can see emptiness directly. Ngumpo mitak lue chu, they see phenomena. Ngumpo is again entities. Mitak, their impermanent nature. And yoachu, that they're deceptive phenomena. They can see that anything that appears is deceptive. It's called in Tibetan kunzo dempa, which means relative truth, but it also means kind of obscured. A truth that is obscured by what? By our projections of self-nature into it. And therefore it's not appearing the way it really is to those who are deceived that way. So all those phenomena and this gets into some beautiful analogies. So means like a shell, a hollow shell. Dong Tongpa means empty. Dak Mepa means without any self. Number one, Shezhoa Dong. They see that they are thoroughly isolated from any aspect of self nature. Thoroughly isolated. That's what that means. So these are 5 qualities about phenomena, about Ngumpo. Number one, thoroughly isolated means that they have no self nature, no objective self nature to them. Mitak, they are impermanent, and therefore you can't count on them. Lua means deceptive, like an illusion. So be cautious about them. Yolk means like shaft or an empty shell. They're insubstantial, insignificant, weak, feeble, without real value, and then therefore not worth accumulating. Tongpa is referring to the phenomena of the heaps or aggregates. They have no real nature, which is urging us to see that lack of self-nature. And Dakme, lacking self. So these 5 qualities validate that all entities are utterly isolated from true existence. So that's how the wise see the world and all of its contents. It's going to go further into that. Neme means maybe make sure I get the words right. Neme in this case means no support. It's still talking about phenomena. Mikba Yumayan means no objective existence. No, Mikba is like an object. Yu means existence. Mayan means none, no objective existence. Sawa Me means they're rootless. Ching means and. Nepa Me means they don't abide. Mikyu Marik means ignorance. I'm sorry, it's not Mikyu, it's ignorance. Marik Yule Xing to Jung mean they vividly arise from causation, but they're Tokma. Tokma means the beginning of them. Ooh. It should be ooh, okay. Tokma, their beginning, ooh, their middle part, their staying, ta, and their end. Nampar, pang, means thoroughly abandoned. So, so this is how the wise see phenomena. And I'll get into all the meanings of these words in a minute, but it goes to the next verse first. It compares all phenomena to Xing, which means a plantain or a water tree. It looks substantial, but if you start knocking into it, it falls apart and it has no real pith or essence. So Zhongqing Jintu, just like a water tree. Ningbo Me, no essence to them. Drise dronker duate, like an appearance of a Drise dronker is like a Gandharva town. A Gandharva town, the best way to translate this, Drisa Gandharva means smell eater, and it's talking about spirits who live off scents. It's not like a ghost town in the sense if you go to a ghost town, you'll see buildings, but no people. Gandharva towns are like, it looks like a real town, but it's like a spirit manifestation. It's not real. It's like an illusion. So that's how phenomena are seen. Yeah, Anila.
Sorry, I was wondering why is it always referred to as there's no objective self nature. Could it be subjective self nature also? I don't
Well,
like why objective.
um, so let's take the case in a mundane level. Have you ever heard somebody say, yeah, that guy treats me like an object? You've heard that on a mundane level, right? When we objectify people or things, they're like objects outside of us. And there's no sense of their lack of self-nature or their dependent arising, and no real appreciation of their real nature. And so if you say somebody objectifies me, you're saying they don't really get me or value me, right? And so that's what ignorance tends to do with phenomena. It just sees phenomena as objects out there, as if they have some real status to them. In Madhyamaka, all schools, Buddhist schools, agree that things are dependently arisen and don't have any self-nature. But the object of negation in Prasangika is when we look at things in the world, we think they're real. And they're really not. They don't exist the way we perceive them to be as truly real from their own side. So anyways, just a way word uses to describe that. Mikvah, that object, the word object, often is as a sense of the part of the phenomena we're observing where we're imputing existence to it. We're imputing existence to it. So in reality, they're like a mirage town, like a spirit town. Then Mombe Drongkar is like a bewildered town, a town of confusion. Mizepe can mean unending, but it has the sense here of being unbearable, horrible. Dro agume shintu nang. Droe can't be translated as transmigrating beings, but here it has a bigger sense of the world, of all transmigrating beings in the world. Yuma Shintu just like it's just like an illusion. Nang, it appears, is just like an illusion. This is to the wise, that all things are essenceless, they have no objective existence, they're like a phantom town, they're like a world, like a town of confusion, and there's no essence to anything in the world. So I'm going to get into this a little bit. How are we doing? Oh, we're over time. I'll get into this next time. I think, this gives enough of a sense of it that I'll break down word by word what it means next time. Any questions? You get that sense that this is helping with renunciation. And that's the first step on the path of the bodhisattva, and it leads to also bodhicitta. But underneath it is the ultimate thing that releases us from that the grip of samsara, which is correct view of dependent arising and emptiness. So I'll put up the closing prayers. Yeah, Stevie.
We can think about this question if it's too big, but you know, this drop of mind that goes from lifetime to lifetime to lifetime to lifetime, is that unending? Is that permanent in a way?
It's not permanent in the sense of unchanging. It's indestructible
Ah,
in that
ah,
no material thing can destroy it because it's more subtle than matter. One moment of it depends on the previous moment to arise. So it's unending. That's the part of the us that goes from here until we're enlightened. And that's the seed, the seed of our Buddha nature. And because it has no self-nature, we can purify it. If we apply the path regularly and in depth, we can purify that until it becomes awakened. And so it's a crucial thing, but it is indestructible.
that helped. Thank you. I was using the wrong word. Thanks.
Sure. Sashi Boki Joji Mental Rira Linshin Yende Gambadi Sangye Shindu Meda Wagi Dogu Nanda Shinga Jabashu Idam Guru Rana Mandala Kanya Yatayami. Sorry. Gawa Dia Gawa Kon Sanam Yashe Zozo Shin Sanam Yashe Lejunwe Dampo Kuni Tobashu. Janju Zanjo Rinpoche, Mage Bana Gege Ge Banya Bame Bayang, Gone Gondu Bawajo, Gari Rawe Goe, Shingande, Abandon Dewa Malu Juene, Genrezi One Dancing Yaso Ye, Shebesi de Badu Deng Your Chi. All right.
Yay, Wilson, thank
Thank you,
you.
Wilson.
So it's good
Yay.
seeing
Thank you,
everybody.
Wilson.
Yeah,
Please live
Take
long,
care.
Wilson.
Live long, keep teaching, Wilson.
yeah.
Thank you.
Everybody stay healthy.
You too. Thank you.
I'll see you soon, hope.
Yeah.
Okay.